The ground gave way beneath her feet. One moment, she was walking the trail with her dog, the air alive with the smell of pine and the faint hush of evening wind. The next, her shepherd lunged forward, claws tearing into loose soil, barking with a raw urgency that froze her blood. She thought it was just another rabbit, another distraction, until she saw it. The earth was moving. Not like an animal burrowing, not like shifting rock. It was heaving, shallow and desperate, as if something, someone, was clawing upward from the other side. Her heart slammed against her ribs, the sound filling her ears. She dropped to her knees, hands digging into cold dirt, the air metallic with the scent of soil freshly torn open. And then, through the grit and dust, she saw fingers, human fingers, mud-caked, trembling, reaching toward the surface like drowning hands breaking water. Her dog barked louder, frantic, circling, digging beside her. She stared at those hands, at the faint groan beneath the soil, and a thought hit her with paralyzing force. Someone was buried alive, and she had seconds to decide whether fear would keep her frozen, or if courage would let her save them. The days after that night stretched like slow, burning candles, the wax dripping heavy and quiet, each moment leaving its residue in the corners of my mind. People called it a miracle. Some whispered the word, fate. But when I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the hum of the streetlight outside blood through my window, I could still hear it. The muffled cries beneath the soil, the desperate scratching of two men trying to claw their way back into life. Ranger, my German shepherd, had not forgotten either. He lay beside me in the dark, restless, his ears twitching at the smallest sound, as if the earth itself still called to him. His eyes glowed faintly in the half-light, and when they caught mine, it was as though he was reminding me we had stepped into something larger than ourselves, and the weight of it was not going away. The police came often, their questions looping back, circling the same points as though searching for cracks in my memory. I could tell they were baffled. How a girl and her dog had found what trained units had overlooked. But beneath their curiosity, I saw something else. Shame, fear, a quiet recognition that their own might have been lost forever, if not for us. One officer, his voice low and trembling, had pressed a hand on my shoulder before leaving. "You don't know what you've done," he whispered. But I did, and yet I also didn't. News vans parked on the street. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. My mother fielded calls while pretending she wasn't shaking. Every sound felt amplified, the ring of the phone, the crack of a door, even Ranger's paws clicking on the kitchen tile. Silence no longer existed, it had been replaced with echoes. Echoes of that burial, echoes of survival. But the heaviest silence of all lived inside me, because I knew what I hadn't told them. I hadn't said that when I first heard the faint knocking, I almost turned away. That fear had crept up my spine and told me, this is not your burden to carry. That I'd stood frozen, every muscle arguing against moving closer, until Ranger's growl forced my legs forward. That silence clung to me. Guilt wrapped around my chest like the soil had wrapped around those men. Because in that breath between running away and stepping forward, I had almost chosen wrong. And it was Ranger, just Ranger, who carried me across that threshold. The night returned in dreams. In them I stood again on the soft earth. The officers' voices reached up through the soil, weaker this time, fading. I tried to dig but my hands turned to stone. I screamed but no sound came. And every time I woke with Ranger pressing against my side, his chest rising and falling steady, grounding me in a rhythm that life, against all odds, had been restored. But still, the silence inside me grew heavier. Not the silence of death, but the silence of secrets. The kind that bends your back slowly until one day you cannot carry it anymore. The mirror in my room became my enemy. Every morning, I would pass by it and catch the reflection of a girl I barely recognized. Her eyes were darker, shadows etched beneath them, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. Her shoulders slumped forward as though carrying a weight invisible to the rest of the world. Sometimes she looked older, years older, and yet she was still me. Ranger would sit by the edge of my bed, his head cocked, his ears tuned to the rhythm of my breathing. It was as though he knew what I could not admit I was unraveling. The night we found those men had not ended. It had lodged itself inside my bones, replaying every time I tried to stand still. At school, whispers followed me down the hallway. Kids who had never spoken to me before now stared as though I carried some kind of strange, fragile magic. "That's her," they'd murmur. "That's the girl who found them." But no one asked the right questions. No one asked if I still heard voices in the silence, or if dirt and sweat still clung to my hands in dreams. They wanted a story, not the truth, and I wanted to disappear. Even the teachers treated me differently, with this mix of awe and pity. One day, during roll call, Mr. Keller's voice cracked slightly as he said my name. He cleared his throat and looked away, but I saw it. The image of two uniforms pulled from the ground had burned into his mind, and somehow I was tethered to it. At home, my mother pretended to be strong, but I could hear her crying at night, muffled through the bathroom door. She never said it aloud, but she was afraid that something about this event had marked me forever. And maybe she was right. Because when I looked in the mirror, I wasn't sure if the girl staring back would ever return to who she was before. Ranger was my only anchor. When the nightmares came, he was there, pressing his body against mine, his heartbeat steady and unwavering. When I walked the streets, feeling eyes on me from every corner, Ranger walked closer, brushing his side against my leg, reminding me I was not alone. He became more than a dog. He was my shadow, my shield, my voice when my own was trapped in silence. And yet, even with him, the question grew louder. Why me? Why had I heard those cries when others hadn't? Why had Ranger pulled me toward that patch of earth, his paws striking the soil as though he already knew? And why, of all people, had we been the ones to bridge life back into the world? The mirror gave me no answers. It only showed me the girl who had stood on the edge of running away, who had almost left two men buried alive. The guilt pressed harder in those reflections than in any nightmare. One evening, the police chief visited our house. He was a heavy-set man, his uniform stretching slightly across his stomach, his face carved with the lines of someone who had seen too much. He didn't come with cameras or press or formalities. He came alone, his hat clutched in his hands like something fragile. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice quiet, carrying a gravity I hadn't expected. He looked at me, then at Ranger, who watched him with steady eyes. "You didn't just save two officers. You reminded us of something we forgot. That listening matters. That instinct matters. That courage isn't always in the badge or the gun. It can be in a girl and her dog." His words should have lifted me, but instead they pressed deeper into the hollow inside me. Courage, I thought. Courage had almost slipped from my fingers. If not for Ranger, courage would have died in that silence. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Ranger sat behind me, his reflection appearing like a silent guardian. I studied myself, the tired eyes, the weight in my shoulders, and whispered, "Who are you now?" My voice cracked, and for a moment I hated the silence that followed. But then Ranger stepped closer, pressing his nose against my hand, grounding me in that small, wordless way that only he knew. And in that instant, the mirror didn't just show a girl, it showed a pair. A girl and her dog. Broken maybe, changed, definitely, but still standing. The girl in the mirror wasn't the same. She never would be. And maybe that was the point. The dirt stayed in my dreams. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it under my fingernails, rough, damp, alive in ways it shouldn't have been. Sometimes I woke with my hands clenched so tight my nails dug half moons into my palms. Other times I swore I smelled it, the wet, earthy scent of a grave interrupted, lingering even when I sat upright in my bed. I tried to avoid that place, the field where it had all happened, but life in a small town doesn't let you hide from the things that have marked you. Kids whispered about it in class. Neighbors spoke of it on porches, their voices hushed but sharp. And one afternoon, walking home from school, I saw a group of people gathered there. Not police, not workers, just ordinary townsfolk, standing on that ground as though it was sacred. They looked down at the earth with the same reverence people reserve for church altars. Ranger tensed beside me, his ears twitching, his muscles taut. He remembered too. He remembered the struggle, the urgency, the way his paws tore at that soil while I hesitated. His whole body seemed to say, "We are bound to this place now." I wanted to turn away, to pretend it wasn't there. But something pulled me forward. The closer we came, the more the whispers died. People looked at me, some with gratitude, others with pity, others with something sharper, like fear. As though I had walked with death and returned. An old woman pressed a hand over her chest when she saw me. "The girl," she murmured, "and her dog." My throat went dry. I didn't want this weight. I didn't want this recognition. I only wanted to be left alone. But the ground beneath my feet wouldn't release me. That night, I told my mother I couldn't sleep. She tried to soothe me with warm milk and soft words, but when I asked, Why me? She had no answer. She only held me tighter, her silence louder than any explanation. Days blurred. Ranger grew restless, pacing the house as though waiting for something to happen. And maybe he felt it before I did, that the story wasn't finished. Because one evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned orange, Ranger pressed against the front door and barked. Not a warning bark, but a call. I followed him outside. The air was cooler than usual, the kind of chill that crept into your skin before autumn fully claimed the world. Ranger led me back toward the field. My heart pounded, my hands trembling, but I didn't stop him. The earth drew us in like a tether. When we reached it, the place was empty. No people, no voices. Only silence. The dirt looked smooth again, grass struggling to reclaim the patches where paws and hands had once dug frantically. The air was heavy, as though it carried memory. I stood there for a long time, the wind pressing strands of hair against my face, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. And then I heard it, not a cry, not a voice, but the echo of my own heartbeat. Loud, steady, alive. I sank to my knees. Ranger pressed close, his head resting against my shoulder. For the first time since that night, I let myself cry. Not sharp, panicked tears, but deep, heavy sobs that wrung out the guilt and fear I had been carrying. The ground beneath me blurred as the tears fell, and I whispered into the soil, "I'm sorry I almost left you. I'm sorry I almost ran." Ranger nudged my cheek, his warm breath grounding me in the present. He had no doubts, no guilt. To him, what mattered was simple: we had heard, we had acted, and 2 men lived because of it. When I finally stood, my knees were damp, my palms dirty. But something had shifted. The ground still carried its weight, but it no longer felt like it was pulling me under. Instead, it felt like a reminder. Solid beneath my feet, steady, unyielding. The days that followed weren't easier, but they were different. At school, when the whispers started, I lifted my chin. At home, when my mother cried quietly behind the bathroom door, I slipped my hand under the crack and waited until she took it. And at night, when Ranger pressed against me, I whispered back to him. We did what we had to do. It wasn't courage that carried me forward. It wasn't heroism, either. It was the ground that had held the weight of 2 men, the ground that had carried my fear, the ground that still held me even as I trembled. For the first time, I realized I could stand on it. I could carry it. I didn't have to be crushed by it. And when I looked down at Ranger, his eyes steady and clear, I knew we already were. The season turned before I was ready. The leaves curled and burned into shades of amber and rust, and the wind carried the bite of something colder. Life kept moving, even as I stood still, but there was no escaping the echo of that night. It lived in the cracks of my days, in the tremor of my breath when silence pressed too close. The town had moved on in its own way. Articles faded from headlines, chatter quieted, and new stories rose to replace ours. But for the men who had lain beneath that soil, and for me, nothing would ever be the same. Weeks after the rescue, there was a gathering at the town hall. I hadn't wanted to go. Crowds made me feel exposed, like a wound prodded open. But my mother insisted, and Ranger's steady eyes told me we belonged there. So I went, my stomach twisted, my palms damped. The hall was filled with people. Neighbors, officers, strangers who had only heard fragments of the story. I felt their eyes again, the weight of their expectations, their awe, their curiosity. I wanted to shrink back into Ranger's shadow, but then I saw them, the 2 men. Alive, standing, breathing. Their uniforms were pressed clean now. Their bodies thinner but upright. One leaned slightly on a cane, the other carried new lines in his face that hadn't been there before. And when they looked at me, there was something in their eyes that I had never seen directed at me before. Gratitude so raw it silenced every whisper in the room. They approached slowly. The crowd parted like water, clearing a path between us. My chest tightened. Ranger pressed against my leg, steadying me. The taller officer, his voice hoarse but sure, said, "We owe you everything." His hand trembled as he reached for mine, not in authority, not in command, but in thanks. I froze for a moment, then let his fingers close around mine. His grip was warm, alive, steady in a way that made the earth beneath me hum. The shorter one knelt slightly, bringing himself level with Ranger. His hand hovered, waiting, until Ranger nudged his palm with his nose. The man's eyes filled with tears, his lips trembling as he whispered, "You knew. You pulled her there. You saved us." Something cracked inside me then. Not guilt, not fear, but release. For the first time since that night, I wasn't trapped in the weight of almost failing. I was standing in the proof of what we had done. 2 men alive, families intact, futures restored. The chief called us forward then. My name echoed across the hall, followed by Rangers. Applause erupted, loud and rolling, like waves crashing against stone. I wanted to run, to hide, but instead I stood still. Ranger sat beside me, calm, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of something eternal. The chief's voice carried through the room. He spoke of courage, of instinct, of the bond between a girl and her dog. He spoke of listening when the world is silent, of following when the path is unclear. And then he placed a small medal in my hand, cold, heavy, shining under the lights. Not for me, but for us. For the night the earth spoke, and we answered. My mother's eyes glistened in the crowd, her smile trembling, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. For once, she wasn't crying in secret. She was crying in pride. Later that night, when the hall was empty and the town had gone back to its rhythms, I stood again before the field. Ranger sat at my side, the medal cool in my pocket. The air was still, the stars scattered across the sky like whispers. I crouched low, pressing my hand to the soil. I hear you, I whispered. Not to ghosts, not to memory, but to the ground itself. I won't forget. Ranger leaned into me, his warmth steady, his eyes reflecting starlight. And for the first time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt rooted. The earth had once buried voices and nearly kept them silent. But that night it had spoken back, and in answering, Ranger and I had found something more than courage. We had found who we were meant to be. When we walked home, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of pine and earth. The ground beneath our feet felt steady, unshakable. And I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, whatever silence came next, we would be ready to listen. The night no longer belonged to shadows, it belonged to us. Some stories don't end when the applause fades, or when the newspapers stop printing names, or when medals sit quietly in drawers. Some stories linger, woven into the cracks of sidewalks, the bend of trees, the rhythm of footsteps at dusk. This was one of those stories. In the weeks after the ceremony, life didn't simply return to normal. Normal had shifted, reshaped itself into something I barely recognized. The town had painted us as heroes, but I didn't feel like one. Heroes are people who act without hesitation, people who run headlong into danger without fear clawing at their insides. I had hesitated. I had wanted to turn back. Even now, that moment gnawed at me. Ranger never carried that weight. He moved through each day with the same steady grace, his paws hitting the ground with purpose, his ears tilting toward sounds I couldn't hear. He was unbothered by whispers, by headlines, by the hush of conversations that still fell whenever we passed. To him the world hadn't changed. I had. And somehow, that difference made him my anchor more than ever. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the cries I'd heard beneath the soil. Sometimes they seemed louder in the silence, sharper, as though etched into the fabric of my memory. But then Ranger would shift closer, pressing his back against mine, his warmth cutting through the cold. And I would remember. Those cries had ended in breath, in voices, in lives continuing. That had to mean something. The officers came back once, not in uniform, not as symbols of survival, but simply as men. They knocked on our door with humble smiles and carried no cameras, no ceremony. They brought homemade bread, wrapped in a towel, and placed it in my mother's hands. For family, one of them said softly. We sat at the kitchen table, the air heavy with unspoken things. They told me about the moment before Ranger, and I found them. The crushing weight, the silence, the certainty that they would never see another sunrise. They told me that my voice, shaky and uncertain as it had been, was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. I listened, my throat tight, my hands trembling around the mug of tea my mother had placed in front of me. I didn't know how to answer, so I only nodded. But when they left, I walked outside, pressed my palms against the cold railing of the porch and let the tears fall freely. Ranger stood beside me, his gaze following the retreating taillights until they vanished into the night. School remained a battlefield of whispers. Some kids admired me, others resented me. A few called me the grave girl, behind my back. But slowly, I learned to walk through it. To let Ranger's presence remind me that truth wasn't in their words. Truth was in what had happened that night and in the bond forged from it. As autumn deepened, I began walking again. Longer paths, quieter routes, just Ranger and me. Sometimes we found ourselves at the field without meaning to, our feet leading us back. Each time, the earth looked softer, grass spreading wider, the scars of that night fading. But to me the ground still whispered. Not in cries of pain but in a reminder you listened. You answered, you were there. And in those walks, something inside me began to shift. The girl in the mirror was still marked, yes, but she was no longer a stranger. She was someone forged in silence and soil, someone who carried both fear and strength. And when she looked back at me now, she wasn't asking who she was. She was reminding me of who I had become. One evening, as the first snow fell, I stood at the edge of town, Ranger sitting tall beside me. The air was sharp, the flakes catching in his fur like tiny stars. I closed my eyes and listened, not for cries, not for voices, but for the silence itself. And in that silence I heard something I had never expected. Peace. Not loud, not overwhelming. Just a soft, steady peace, layered beneath the wind and the crunch of snow. It was the earth speaking again, not in desperation this time, but in reassurance. I knelt beside Ranger, pressing my forehead to his, feeling the warmth of his breath against my skin. "We did it," I whispered. "We carried it, and we'll keep carrying it." He wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, as though agreeing. And for the first time since that night, I let myself believe it. Some stories end in silence. Ours began there. And though the world may forget, I know the earth never will. Because it was the earth that spoke first, and it was a girl and her dog who chose to listen. And that choice, the choice to listen, would echo for the rest of my life. Time has a way of dulling details. Faces blur, voices fade, moments slip through memory like water through open hands. But some nights, when the house is quiet and Ranger's breathing steadies the dark, I find myself back there again, kneeling in the dirt, listening to cries buried beneath the earth. It doesn't come with the same sharp fear it once did. Not anymore. Now it arrives softer, like a shadow that sits beside me rather than pressing down on my chest. I've learned not to fight it, I let it settle. I let it remind me of who I was and who I became. There are days I wonder how different things might have been if Ranger hadn't stopped, if I hadn't listened, if I had kept walking. The weight of those questions used to crush me, but with time they've transformed into something else. Not guilt, not regret, but reverence. Reverence for the fragility of chance, for the miracle hidden inside a single choice. Ranger never changed. He's still the same steady heartbeat that carried me through silence. He doesn't know the words hero or savior. To him it was simple. He heard something. We followed. We answered. Dogs don't complicate things the way humans do. They just listen. They trust. And sometimes they save the world without ever knowing it. I've grown taller since that night. My hair is longer, my voice a little stronger. The kids at school no longer whisper, though sometimes their eyes still linger when I pass. The officers return to their lives, carrying their scars in quieter ways. My mother smiles more now, though sometimes I still catch her looking at me as though she can see both the child I was and the girl who walked out of that night. And me. I stand differently now. Not because I want to, but because the earth beneath me taught me how. I know it can hold weight heavier than I imagined. I know it can keep secrets, cradle silence, and then give it back when someone is brave or foolish enough to listen. The field where it happened has grown wild again. Grass sways freely, taller now, soft in the wind. Sometimes I walk there with Ranger, just the two of us. He runs ahead, nose low, tail high, and for a moment, it's almost as if that night never happened. Almost. But when I kneel and press my hand into the soil, I feel it. The memory, the breath, the life. The earth that once swallowed voices now carries mine in return. I tell it thank you, for holding them, for releasing them, for teaching me what silence can mean. When the sun sets, the field glows gold, and Ranger's silhouette cuts against the horizon, tall, steady, unshaken. That's the image I carry when the memories press too close. Not the dirt, not the cries, not the fear, but the sight of my dog against the fading light, the bond between us stronger than words. And if someday the silence speaks again, I know we'll be there, not because we are heroes, not because we want to be, but because once when the earth cried out, a girl and her dog listened. And that, more than anything, is what will echo long after the world forgets. The chaos had thinned by the time dawn arrived, yet the girl still felt the weight of the night pressing against her chest. She sat on the curb, her knees pulled close while the German shepherd leaned against her side. His fur was damp from sweat and dust, and every time he exhaled, it came out as a soft huff, the sound of a heart that had worked harder than it was ever meant to. Red and blue lights washed over their faces in intervals. Paramedics bustled around them, tending to the officers who now lay on stretchers. alive but broken, their breathing shallow, their skin pale with exhaustion. She watched as masks were fitted over their mouths, IV lines inserted, hands pressing gently against battered ribs to check for fractures. Each movement was practiced, precise, clinical, but beneath it all she could hear relief, almost reverence. No one had expected to pull men out alive from beneath so much earth. The shepherd nudged her hand with his nose, as if reminding her that the moment wasn't just about the chaos they had endured, but also about the quiet between it. The fact that she was still here, he was still here, and together they had done something that the world would not soon forget. When one of the officers was wheeled past, he lifted a trembling hand toward her. His voice cracked with dryness, but the words slipped out anyway. You saved us." She wanted to tell him she hadn't, that it was the shepherd who had clawed, who had barked, who had led her hands to where her courage alone would have failed. But the man's eyes closed before she could answer, and the stretcher rolled on, disappearing into the back of an ambulance. The shepherd's ears twitched. He gave a low, protective growl when a medic leaned too close, then settled when the girl whispered his name. She rubbed the fur behind his ear, letting the gesture anchor her in the storm of the night. For so long, she had carried the weight of being small, of being unseen. But tonight, under the floodlights and the gaze of men who wore uniforms, her voice had mattered. Her choices had shifted the course of lives. As the last ambulance pulled away, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The street, once filled with chaos, now held only the hum of engines and the crackle of radios. The shepherd circled once before lying down at her feet, his head resting against her shoe. She bent over him, pressing her forehead to his, and for the first time since it all began, she let her tears fall. It was not sadness exactly, nor even fear. It was the release of something buried deep, the acknowledgement that the night had carved a scar into her that would never fade, but also etched a light that would never dim. Weeks later, she would walk past the same street and see it transformed. Flowers lined the pavement, notes folded into plastic sleeves taped to the lampposts, a banner stretched across the corner, thanking the first responders, but tucked in the corner, a smaller note had been scrawled in hurried handwriting. To the girl and her dog, heroes among us. She stood there staring at it, while the shepherd sat at her side, tail sweeping slowly against the ground. She didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were men who wore badges, who carried radios and fought storms with training. She was just a girl who had been in the wrong place at the right time, with a dog who never left her side. And yet, perhaps that was the truth of it. That sometimes, heroes didn't arrive with fanfare or medals. Sometimes they arrived in sneakers and with a leash looped around their wrist, guided not by authority but by loyalty and love. The officers recovered slowly. She visited once, shyly, uncertain if she belonged in the sterile hallways of the hospital. But when she walked into the room, both men looked up, their eyes filling with something wordless. Gratitude, recognition. A bond that had been forged not in years of friendship but in minutes of terror and trust. One of them reached out, resting his palm on her shoulder. His hand was rough, bandaged, but the pressure was steady. "We're here because you didn't give up." She opened her mouth to answer, but her throat tightened, and it was the shepherd who broke the silence with a soft whine. Both officers laughed, weak but genuine, and in that sound she felt something heal inside her. Time passed, but the night never left her. Sometimes she would wake to the sound of sirens in her dreams, to the phantom weight of soil in her hands, the muffled cries echoing beneath her ribs. But always, when the fear clawed at her chest, she would feel the warmth of the shepherd pressed against her, steady and real, grounding her in the present. He had been more than her companion that night. He had been her compass, her courage, her reason to act when the world demanded more than she thought she had to give. And in the months that followed, she realized he always had been. The town never forgot. At the annual ceremony honoring service and sacrifice, her name was called alongside the officers. She stood awkwardly at the edge of the stage, dressed not in uniform but in the simplicity of who she was, while the shepherd sat tall beside her, chest puffed, ears forward, as if he knew this recognition was his as much as hers. When the applause rose, she felt heat rush to her cheeks. It was overwhelming, like being swept into a tide she hadn't asked to swim in. But then she looked down, into the brown eyes of the dog who had once been dismissed as just a pet. And she remembered the moment when those same eyes had looked up at her through dust and darkness. and she stood taller. She accepted the plaque with trembling hands, not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. It was proof that the night had not been swallowed by silence, proof that voices buried beneath earth and fear could rise again. Years from now, when she would tell the story, to children, to strangers, to anyone who asked, she would not begin with the officers or the rescue. She would begin with the shepherd, with the way his ears had caught sounds she could not hear, with the way his paws had clawed through dirt with a desperation that mirrored her own heart, with the way he had taught her that sometimes the smallest among us are asked to carry the heaviest weight, and somehow we do. And when her voice cracked at the telling, she would always reach down to touch the place where his collar had once rested, a reminder that he had not just been her dog, but her witness, her partner, her proof that love could turn fear into strength. Because in the end, the story was not only about survival, nor even about rescue. It was about the bond between a girl and her dog, a bond so fierce it pulled life from beneath the earth, so unshakable it silenced doubt, so profound it turned an ordinary night into legend. The world had called them heroes, but in her heart she knew the truth. They had simply been what they always were, a girl and her dog walking side by side into the unknown, choosing, always, to face it together. And as she remembered the night one final time, the image that lingered was not the flashing lights or the stretchers rolling into darkness. It was the feel of her dog's heartbeat beneath her palm, steady, relentless, alive. The proof that even buried voices could be heard, if only someone dared to listen.